Welcome to Social Justice Saturday with the Radical Social Worker. So in this video, we're going to continue discussing the social justice implications with COVID-19. And today we're going to talk specifically about racism. So racism is revealing itself in a variety of ways right now during this pandemic. By now, you've all probably seen the headlines that demonstrate the variety of ways that racism is manifesting in the era of COVID-19. And there's a lot to unpack, but we're going to start right here. By calling COVID-19 Chinese virus, that's a big verbal cue to begin to blame an entire population of people for this virus. And what we've seen as the result of using that terminology, we've started to see an uptick in violence in the targeting of Asian Americans and Asian people in the United States. We can't ignore the timing of that increase in violence and discrimination towards Asian people in the United States when that is occurring basically simultaneously as this virus is spreading. People in positions of leadership and positions of power are using terminology like Chinese virus. Now, people have started to slowly back off from using that terminology, but the damage is already done. When you have that type of propaganda type language being utilized, it does begin to justify the targeting of a specific group of people. So we now have this kind of overt racism that's occurring during this pandemic, and it's all associated with positions of power using or exploiting a group of the population to try to shift the heat and the blame away from those in positions of power and instead onto a vulnerable portion of the community. We are also seeing overt racism like this: police handcuffing a black doctor outside his own home as he loaded supplies into a van, or black patrons being kicked out of Walmart because they're wearing masks like everyone else is supposed to be doing. This, along with the use of the phrase Chinese virus, are examples of overt racism, but this overt racism isn't possible without the existence of systemic racism. Overt racism is justified by systemic or institutional racism. Racist scapegoating isn't new. It's rooted in this idea of what it means to be a true American, that a real American is a white American, and anyone who isn't white must not be truly an American. There is an assumption of immigrant status. So when there are people in the United States who look Asian, it is assumed that there is some sort of immigrant status. Right now, the hype is around COVID-19 and its origins from China. There then begins to be the assumption that any Asian person must be from China. And so that narrative, rooted in white supremacy, rooted in racism, that a true American is a white American, automatically puts the assumption on the table that any person who looks Asian must be an immigrant, and they therefore must have immigrated from China, and so they must have brought the virus with them. And so this scapegoating begins to happen, where now people who look of Asian descent that are in the United States automatically become the cause of the virus spreading. And so that puts them at risk for hate crimes, for discrimination, for violence. Those types of belief systems are the framework behind using terminology like the Chinese virus. We also see justification for overt racism against the black community, for example, with the police officers handcuffing the black doctor outside his own home, or the black men who were kicked out of Walmart for wearing masks like everyone else. We see justification of that type of overt racism in the assumption of criminality among black people, specifically black men. And this belief system has been formed over generations It involves the use of the media. It involves the use of old, deeply rooted historical portrayals of Black men as animalistic and inherently violent. While those things may seem like relics of the past, they inform and are underlying many of our beliefs today. They inform the trend of mass incarceration of people of color, particularly young Black men. And so when we have these long-standing historical beliefs that underpin our present, it allows for people to justify in the moment assumption of criminality, because we are informed by these long-standing beliefs and norms that Black men will commit crimes and be violent at a higher rate. We then react in real time, and that bias manifests in real time, and then we have situations like we're seeing now with COVID-19 and the discrimination that is happening to people in the Black community. So another way that racism is being demonstrated right now during this pandemic has to do with disparities in health in communities of color. And what we're seeing right now is that COVID-19 is impacting communities of color at a higher rate, but it's really important to unpack why. So in the United States, we have a long history of systemic oppression and systemic racism. And it's a lot to unpack, so we're gonna just kind of skim the top for the purposes of this video. But with that long history of systemic racism, there are a lot of implications for health. For generations, communities of color have been denied equal access to medical care, to health care. And even when access to health care was available, the quality was often lacking compared to white communities. And so the result of that, the result of first not having access, not having equal access, and then when access is available, the quality often being less, what that amounts to is generations of chronic, untreated health conditions. We also have to look at the role that poverty plays in that and the relationship between poverty and racism. Communities of color are disproportionately experiencing poverty, and poverty also has implications for serious, untreated health issues. And we know that this virus tends to be more deadly for people who have pre-existing conditions. What is starting to become a narrative now is that communities of color have higher levels of chronic and pre-existing conditions, and therefore they are more susceptible to the deadly effects of this virus. And here's where we have to be really careful with this narrative. Because our long history of racism in this country, there is a set of social norms and social rules that prescribe a lesser moral character to people of color. And this has been reiterated and enforced for centuries through media coverage, through literature, through policy, through elected officials, through other types of leadership. That narrative has been reinforced over time, and we often don't realize that it's an undercurrent for a lot of the social norms that we have today. What tends to happen is we have these underlying kind of rules and truths about our society. And one of them is that people of color lack moral character, or they are more susceptible to immorality, to violence, to addiction, to all of these things. And what ends up happening is then that gets equated to, well, there must be something inherently wrong with people of color, that they are so susceptible to these things. It must be because of some fault within them. But the reality is that's not true at all. It all has to do with the centuries of oppression which cause people of color to be more impacted by poverty, to be more impacted by chronic health conditions because of that lack of access and lack of care. That's what it's about. Now that we are starting to see from the demographic data that this virus is more deadly for communities of color, now the individual blaming is starting to happen. Now it is shifting to, oh, well, it's more deadly for this specific population. So that means that the problem lies with this specific population. And that's where the narrative starts to get dangerous. When we start blaming already vulnerable communities for the impact that this virus is having on them. Well, if you would just take better care of yourself, then you wouldn't be having the impact that you're having. And that type of narrative fails to address the long-standing oppression and racism that has contributed to greater health disparities and chronic conditions in the first place. So we need to be really careful right now with the way that we're talking about how this virus is impacting communities of color. And if you're going to talk about a higher level of chronic health conditions, then you've got to have the full conversation. You have to connect why those chronic conditions, why that lack of healthcare exists. It's our longstanding history of racism and oppression that have created those conditions. Those conditions have existed for so long now that it feels normal and it feels as though that's just the way it's always been. And so unless you're willing to really dig and learn and do the research and learn how those conditions were created, it's going to be really hard for you to be able to hear those messages, see that narrative and think, no, that's not right. So to recap, we're seeing racism play out right now with COVID-19 in a variety of ways. We're seeing it in the very overt kind of way, but we're also seeing racism in a way that is often harder for people to distinguish because we are so used to it existing in one way or another. And the conditions that history has created with lack of access, more chronic conditions, more poverty, and those conditions that have been created over time are what is causing this virus to have a more deadly impact in communities of color. We need to be looking at the systemic reasons that they are more susceptible to death and severe symptoms with this virus, because there are systemic reasons. We need to be owning up to that and really looking at that hard and figuring out ways to remedy those problems. And that's going to take a lot of work, but the first thing we have to do is we have to be able to actually talk about it and talk about it in the right way with the full conversation and the full context. And that includes talking about racism. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye.